Video number 101. I'm feeling some eustress for reasons that I won't elaborate on now, but I'll go back into talking about context notes that I made. And they're a bit out of order because when I don't make videos for days and then I'm typing notes, I don't really keep track of any logical order that they go in per se. And I was thinking about how context itself is sort of disorder. It's like this greater expanse of information, and then the content is something that we unfold from the context and we appoint as meaningful. So there's infinite context, but we're pulling from a very limited amount of the context. So the context of the experiences that I've had is something different than the words trying to describe that context. So even the words that are somewhat contextual are content extrapolated from the experience, the context of the experience, not just the experience itself. Not just describing the experience in terms of content, but unfolding the implications as well. And it seems to me that context is disorder in a way because it's not the order of the way our brains have been programmed to see and make meaning of things. But at the same time, it's like a greater order in that it's an unfolded order. It's an order that we haven't yet made meaning out of or seen any meaning in. Maybe that's part of it, that meaningful domain wants us to see the meaning of the meaningful domain instead of making the same meanings all the time, because then it becomes meaningless because we start to not even perceive the things that we're no longer making meaning out of. And that's part of the learning process. It's part of what is designed in our brain, so we keep learning. And oftentimes we replace that with the process of continuing to desire more and more things. But really, I think that redundancy process, or that hedonic adaptation, as Jason Silva says in his videos, is for us to keep learning. But we've been told what to know, and so we stop learning, become habits, and we desire and desire more and more and more and more, instead of learning, which is innately fulfilling without needing to desire any particular thing. And by desiring something in particular, we're actually missing out on everything else that we could be perceiving, but our little ego probe compass has put its little feelers out for something in particular that we think that we want. And then oftentimes when we get it, we're already wanting the next thing. So I think that pleasure-desire process has taken over learning. And actually part of my eustress right now has to do with desire in a way, and I can see that it's possible that this desire will block learning because of that very thing. And not to say that desire is bad. It's one part of the functionality of the spectrum, of the kaleidoscope of tools we have within our brain through which to learn. But it's the one that we've made dominant. And when that one is overutilized, it sort of crowds out those other capacities those other human dimensions. So one dimension is desire, perhaps, and that takes over nearly everything. And desire is tied into the me and the ego, whereas the other human dimensions are tied more into world centricity and altruism and the common humanity and the connection. And there are definite physical desires, as in needs, and then we extend those into mental desires through our image making process. And I was talking about the Little Book of Clarity by Jamie Smart, and he talked about implication-based learning, and I can't remember if I talked about how this process of context unfolding in self-dialogue in a way is implication-based learning, because I'm reading between the lines of my experience and then also talking to myself, and reading between the lines of talking to myself. So I'm just seeing further and further possible implications, and perhaps that's part of what Dr. David Bohm talks about, the implicit order and the explicit order. There's things that are implicit and there's things that are explicit. So I wonder what the implications are of creating diverse context versus the implications of just subscribing to the mainstream paradigm. I wonder if map consciousness is trying to crowd out ego consciousness. It definitely crowds it out for a certain period of time. And I wonder if context creation can sort of crowd out the amount of knowledge that I have about the mainstream paradigm. I wonder if one day it'll just be a distant memory for me. Because right now I'm still in it, yet I'm talking about things that are possibly outside of it, but then maybe one day I'll be outside of it as well as talking about things outside of it. And then not talking about things outside of it in reference to it, not talking about it at all. And that could be part of the game of map consciousness, is seeing the implications. Going into that other state of consciousness where we see the implications, we're super sensitive and we can see those implications. And perhaps since we're seeing the implications of things and we're actually acting based on the total pattern of perception of the implications, the total pattern implications of what we're perceiving and where that could lead and what that means and where that came from, and all these different extrapolations to infinity, we become overwhelmed and behave in an apparent disordered way, but we're reacting to a different order of reality that we can't all sense all the time. We can see the implications and extrapolate, and that's what crushes us. That's what also elevates us at the beginning, seeing the implications of love and then seeing the implications of hate and judgment. And what are the implications of one person on a long-term medication treatment versus being able to transform and transcend and move into a different path? And I could say to myself that I have a psychotic disorder, or I could say that I have an interesting and unique relationship with the universe. Sometimes I ride the roller coaster of the universe, the roller coaster of the spectrum and scale of consciousness. And I feel like the temporary incapacitation that happens during psychosis sometimes is a re-emerging capacitation. It's emerging with different capacities, just like a caterpillar goes into a chrysalis, is completely immobile and protected and safe, and then emerges with completely different capacities. And that stillness is required for the imaginal cells of our consciousness to rearrange our consciousness in such a way that we reemerge with these new capacities, this habilitation aspect. It's like the reset button on the computer, and it's like how if you're doing maintenance on a machine, you shut it down. You don't try to work on it while it's moving around. And I feel like the universe is rewriting our DNA and changing our epigenetic expression. And I wrote down that when we're controlled by the programs, we feel like we have free will. But free will is just the ego talking to itself about making decisions. And that ego voice is our own voice turned against us. And it's programmed, it's other thoughts and conditionings from society. And then we call that choosing between one thought and another thought free will. And map consciousness comes in and shows us more about true free will. And I was thinking about how words block perception, and another way it could, in a way, is that our words, our sounds, our voice, even in our own head, in our own voice, it blocks the nervous system from fully perceiving, in that those words are vibrating through all the nerves. That is going through our whole nervous system electrically. And those words vibrating through our nervous system are meaning that the nervous system isn't quiet, it's not silent, and so it can't actually accurately perceive the vibrations that are incoming, because there is a vibration already happening in terms of our own voice. And so a lot of what we are perceiving gets blocked out by the fact that we're already having words happening in our nervous system. And then it could be possible that it's blocking the epimemetics and the endomemetics, the voice of the universe speaking to us and speaking through us and animating us as the voice of the universe, not just the voice of one's personal ego programming. And so it blocks perception. One can't see actuality when words are a barrier to that. And I wonder if there could be like a religion of human neurology developed from the principles from map consciousness. And I feel like the principles are the principles of the human nervous system when it's not blocked by abstractions about reality. And when we're not abstracting about reality, we're actually feeling it fully, and we're more sensitive to it, and it's more challenging to actually go about life. And I'm really wondering if all this self-dialogue will change what I tune into next time I do go into map consciousness. Because I've never spent 6 months talking to myself about it. And since I did go into that state, known as psychosis, 3 times in 14 months, after the end of this month, in a couple of weeks, it'll be the longest I've gone without going into that state. So it'll be interesting to see if I can stay out of that state beyond 8 months to a year to 2 years to 3 years. I wonder if I can feel like, oh, the universe is just on my case again. I wrote something down about, I don't really know what I was talking about, but something along the lines of psychosis as getting to this point where one is trying to run away from thought, in terms of actually running away physically, or having behaviors that are labeled as, say, paranoia, which is like almost wanting to run away or wanting to hide. It's like trying to run away and hide from the collective consciousness of thought. So it's one thing to have a fearful thought and then push it away with another thought. That's a form of running away from a fearful thought. But as it gets more and more accumulated, one actually is literally running away from the projections of the collective unconsciousness, not just linear projected thoughts of one's own personal individuality. And it's actually seen and taken personal when it's gotten to the point of, say, thinking somebody's after oneself. In a way, thought is after us. It's not us, and we usually identify with our thoughts. And so going into psychosis is just an extreme form, is identifying with thoughts. And then these thoughts seem more unreasonable to people who are observing from the outside. But those very people have a very similar process going on in their mind that could easily get to the point where it's also supposedly out of control. And that could be part of it. Krishnamurti says the controller is the controlled. So normally we are controlling our thoughts and we feel like we're controlling them. But that's just another thought controlling it. So it's just one thought after another, and one thought, the thought prior sort of takes this position of I'm the one that created that next thought, and so I'm controlling it. But maybe when that process breaks down to some extent, the thoughts get out of control and they start to pile up, and then one feels like they're not in control of their thoughts. And when that happens, it can sort of, instead of just going from like one bad thought to one good thought, from one bad thought to one good thought, when there's no controller, it can go from bad thought to bad to worse to build up to all of a sudden the whole world is ending, when really maybe it's the world of thought getting to the very end of it. And over time, we've evolutionarily, we have the reflex to say, jump away from a snake. Well, in psychosis, so-called psychosis, it's like we're running away from some bigger, scarier thing. But it's all sort of an image in our minds. And I'm not saying that's wrong. It's sort of a natural consequence of the original process, which is actually seen as healthy. And that original process is never questioned. It seems like it's a reflex to get away from thought, because in mania, one is sort of getting away from thought and going into that collective beauty and up the levels of consciousness. And as one starts to come down the levels of consciousness, one starts to experience more and more thoughts. And they're thoughts that weren't identified originally with the person who's experiencing them. So then they seem like something other, but it's actually showing us the consequence of thought in general. And then the mania is showing us what happens when there's less thought and more light of consciousness and awareness. One sees the whole accumulated thought structure and starts to run. And there was an article that I read about the cost of something, I don't know what it was, like say sitting or something like that. And I wonder what the cost of habitual conditioned thinking is, of our regular ego thought process. And there's a lot more research right now about things like the flow state, and it's some semi-elusive state and difficult to get into. But what if that's our natural way to be, and we're supposed to be in that state 95% of the time, and use our ego consciousness, say, 5% of the time, but really that's happening to the opposite extent. So what is the cost of that? And a lot of certain things they do studies about that have costs associated with it. We never actually studied the level of thinking behind what that behavior is. And in a way, so-called psychosis is like the universe thinking through us, for us, and it's not always a welcome thing. but it's definitely a different type of thinking, and it produces different types of behavior. And so map consciousness is the design of the universe to make sure we don't get stuck in habitual patterns that are going to lead us towards destruction. It tries to help us to explore other modes and ways and behaviors and gestures of being, just as children do. And we're inner explorers. I thought of the term astronauts. They talk about psychonauts as people who take psychoactive substances, but it's almost like astronauts. They talk about the astral plane. I don't really know much about that, but I just thought astronauts was kind of a funny word. I even think map consciousness is a type of consciousness medicine. And at a certain dose, it can be poisonous and lethal, but at the right dose, it can be healing. And just as when one has a fever, one needs to rest. When one has map consciousness, there could be a rest period that's needed as well. It's sort of like a natural mechanism, just like a fever. And just as a fever is designed to kill off the organisms, the microorganisms that aren't beneficial to our system, I feel like map consciousness is supposed to kill off some of the thoughts and thinking that is not beneficial to our mental consciousness system. And part of the medicine of map consciousness is that a person might come back with medicinal messages. So it not only kills off the bad thoughts some of the time, it can create some new endomemes and epimemes that might be medicinal for the person in terms of maybe past things that needed to be integrated. And just as it's actually important for children to have the common childhood diseases in order to build their immune system for later life, it could be important for people to go into map consciousness in order to build this sort of immunity to being caught in habit or being caught in conformity or rigidity